I shouldn't have taken that road, but it was too late now, and I would never forget what I saw that night. I was driving home after a grueling shift at the restaurant. I worked in Provo, but I lived in a small town just outside. The main road was blocked by construction, so I had to take Provo Canyon. It was late. The car radio was crackling, no signal. The sky was dark, moonless, and I was the only living soul on that empty road. At least, that's what I thought. I drove slowly, watching out for dangerous curves. The fog covered the road, making everything more difficult. The car's headlights only illuminated a few feet ahead. Then, I saw her, a woman standing on the shoulder, alone, a white dress flowing, her bare feet on the cold asphalt. Her hair fell over her face, and even without seeing her eyes, I knew she was looking at me. My heart raced. I instinctively slammed on the brake. The woman was still there, motionless. She looked fragile, lost, but something was wrong, so wrong. I had heard stories about her before. Drivers talked about a woman in white hitchhiking, and whoever stopped was either never seen again or spent the rest of their lives haunted by what they saw. I swallowed hard. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel. I shouldn't stop, but then she slowly raised one of her hands. Hitchhiking. Her fingers were too thin, too long, and something inside me screamed to speed up, but I couldn't, because before I could react, she was already standing next to the car. My breath caught. The woman in white didn't move. She just appeared there, too close, her face still covered by her dark hair, her body still, like a statue. And then, she knocked on the window, once, twice, 3 times. Each knock echoed inside my head. The window began to fog up on its own. My fingers trembled on the steering wheel. I needed to get out of there, but before I could react, she leaned in and whispered through the window, low, slurred, "Take me home." Panic took over me. I stepped on the accelerator. The tires skidded on the asphalt, and in seconds, she was behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest. The road ahead seemed endless, but something was wrong. I felt it. I wasn't alone anymore. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and I almost lost control of the car. She was there, sitting in the back seat, pale. Her eyes were now visible, black, empty, and then she smiled. The whole car shook. The lights on the dashboard flickered. The radio crackled on its own, and her voice echoed inside my mind. "Why did you leave me there?" My lungs burned. My fingers locked on the steering wheel. I didn't know what to do. She was still back there, but then she was gone. The car was silent, but I could still feel it. The smell of damp earth, the presence in the air. I knew it wasn't over. And then I heard the laughter, low, whispered, right next to my ear, as if she were still there. The car shook violently. The road distorted. The headlights went out for a second, and when they came back on, she was on the road, right in front of me. I tried to swerve, but it was too late. The car spun on the track. The world spun. And the last thing I saw was her black eyes watching me, and a whisper, "Now you'll never leave me again." I woke up a few hours later. The car was on the side of the road, crushed, but intact. The sun was already rising on the horizon, and I was alone. Or at least, that's what I thought, until I looked in the rearview mirror again and saw, etched on the fogged glass, "Come back to me." I never drove through Provo Canyon again, but every night, at 3 a.m., my window opens by itself, and in the mirror in my bedroom, her reflection is still there, smiling, waiting, because I shouldn't have left her behind, and now she'll never leave me. I never went through Provo Canyon again, but that didn't mean I had escaped, because even though I was far away, she was still with me. The nights were never the same. Every morning, at 3 a.m., my window would open by itself. The cold wind would blow in, and in the darkness of my room, I could hear her breathing, low, close, but always invisible. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just trauma, but then the messages started. The morning after the accident, I picked up my phone. My lock screen had a strange notification, "Come back to me." But the scariest thing was that the message had no sender. I spent days without proper sleep. The lights in my house would flicker for no reason. The radio would turn on by itself, and the bathroom mirror. It was always foggy, even without steam, and on it, there were always fingerprints, little trails, as if someone had run their hand across the glass, and written words I didn't want to understand. It wasn't until Ashley, my girlfriend, came over to sleep over that I realized I wasn't hallucinating. That night, I woke up to her scream. I got up startled. She was in the corner of the room. Her face was pale, her eyes were wide, and she was pointing at the mirror. On the glass, written in shaky letters, "Take me home." My stomach turned. Ashley was shaking. There's someone here." My blood ran cold, because I already knew that. The lamp flickered, the temperature dropped, and that was when we felt it. The mattress sank by itself, as if someone invisible had laid down there. Ashley sobbed, but before she could run, the door closed by itself, and the whisper came from the dark, low, slurred. "Why did you leave me there?" The shadow in the mirror moved, and then the woman in white appeared, standing in the reflection, but not in the room. Pale, dressed dirty and torn, her eyes black as the road that night. And then she smiled. The glass cracked, and Ashley screamed again, but I already knew what I had to do. I grabbed my car keys, I grabbed my phone, and I headed back to Provo Canyon. The road was deserted. The wind whispered between the cliffs, and then I saw it. She was there, in the same place, standing on the shoulder, waiting for me, her feet still bare, her dress moving by itself, her hair falling over her face. And then she raised her hand. "Hitchhiking," again. My body was shaking, but this time I stopped. The passenger door opened by itself. I looked at the empty seat, and then I smelled the damp earth. She was there, even though I couldn't see her. Then her voice whispered beside me, "Take me home." I swallowed hard and started driving. The minutes passed. The silence was suffocating, but I knew she was still there. I could feel her eyes on me. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further. My fingers froze on the steering wheel, and then the radio turned on by itself. An old song played, something from the 50s, and on the radio's digital display, the word "thank you" appeared, low, slow, as if someone was writing on the other side. My heart raced, the road got darker, the GPS stopped working, and suddenly, the passenger seat started to sink, as if someone was getting out of it. Then, everything went silent. The road ahead seemed brighter. The radio turned off. The temperature returned to normal, and when I looked to the side, she was gone. The seat seemed untouched. The door was still closed. The car was silent, but on the passenger window, there was one last message, written with invisible fingers in the dust. "Now I can rest." I sighed. A weight lifted from my shoulders, and finally, I drove home. Since that night, I have never seen the woman in white again, but sometimes, late at night, my radio still turns on by itself, and the same 50s song plays softly, as if she were just reminding me that she is still around. I should never have entered that place, but curiosity was stronger than fear. The Sugar House Asylum in Salt Lake City was demolished years ago, but they say that not all the souls left there. Residents still report screams in the early hours of the morning, sounds of doors slamming, whispers coming from a building that no longer exists. And that night, I found out why. It all started when my friend Jake suggested we explore the place. "It's just an empty lot now," he said, "but they say you can still hear the patients." He smiled, but his eyes weren't so sure. I didn't believe in such things, and deep down, I wanted to prove that it was just a legend. So, I accepted the challenge. Midnight. The air was freezing. The wind blew through the dead trees, and there we were, in front of the lot where the asylum used to be. The rusty gate was still there, locked with chains, but Jake found a hole in the fence. "I think that's where the beggars got in," he muttered. And then we walked in. The lot was strangely empty, no debris, no trace of the old asylum. But as we stepped inside, something changed. The air grew heavier, the darkness seemed thicker, and the silence, it was absolute. No sounds from the city, no wind, just us, and whatever was still there. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered. I stopped. I listened, and then I heard it, low, far away, but unmistakable. A scream. My hair stood on end. Jake laughed, but his laugh sounded forced. Must be a cat or something. But he didn't believe his own words, and neither did I. We kept walking. The flashlight illuminated the dirt floor, and that's when we saw it. A door, alone, in the middle of nowhere, standing there as if it still led somewhere. My chest tightened. Jake took a deep breath, and then he knocked on the door. Once, twice, 3 times, and then it opened by itself. Nothing but darkness on the other side. No walls, no rooms, just empty. And from the depths of that nothingness, the sound came again, low, slurred, whispered. "Are you listening?" My heart raced. Jake grabbed my arm. The door began to creak, like someone was leaving. We ran. The grounds seemed bigger than before. Shadows moved around us, and then the screams really started. Loud, desperate, sounds of torture, of pain, of madness, and they came from every direction, as if the asylum was still there, and the patients were still suffering. My legs burned. Jake gasped beside me, and then he stumbled. He fell face down in the dirt. The flashlight rolled away. I turned to help him, but that's when I saw it. Something came out of the ground, a hand, skinny, pale, fingers too long. It grabbed Jake's ankle and pulled. Jake screamed. He struggled, but the hand wouldn't let go. Another one came out, and another one, and then suddenly, several hands came out of the ground. The screams got louder. My body froze, but Jake looked me in the eye, the panic on his face, and then he screamed my name. That snapped me out of my shock. I grabbed his arm. I pulled with all my strength, and then the hands were gone, the screams were gone, and we were outside the lot. The gate was closed behind us, as if it had never been opened. The silence returned. The wind blew again, and when we looked back, the lot was empty. No door, no footprints, nothing. But then we heard it, for the last time, a whisper, low, inside our heads. "Now you're part of this too." Ever since that night, Jake has never been the same, neither have I, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, the radio turns on by itself, static, and in the background of the hiss, I can still hear the screams. I tried to forget, but the nursing home didn't forget about me. After that night, nothing was the same. Jake disappeared for a while. He stopped answering my calls. He stopped leaving the house, until one night, he texted me. I still hear them. My stomach turned, because I heard them too. Every night, at 3:15 in the morning, the radio would turn on by itself. The hissing would fill my room, and in the middle of the static, the screams would come back, soft at first, then louder, then deafening, and then the whisper would come, always the same, always in my ear. "You guys should have never come in." I would turn off the radio, but in the bathroom mirror, the glass was always foggy, and written on it, the same word, "Come back." Jake and I tried to ignore it, but a month later, he showed up at my house, eyes sunken, face pale, hands shaking, and he said something that made me freeze. "She talked to me." My chest tightened. "Who?" Jake swallowed hard. "The woman at the door." The air seemed to disappear. "You're saying that?" He closed his eyes. "She showed up in my room." My skin crawled. I was asleep, but I woke up with the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I looked at the foot of the bed, she was there. My blood ran cold. Jake continued. She was tall. She wore a hospital gown, ragged, dirty, but her face. He took a deep breath. It was wrong. Her eyes were black. Her mouth was sewn shut. But still, I heard her voice inside my head. And then, Jake grabbed my arm tightly, and he repeated her words, quietly, slurred. "Come back, or we'll take you." My whole body shivered, but deep down, I knew what I had to do. We had to get back to the asylum. 3 a.m. The rusty gate was there, but it wasn't closed. This time, it was already open, like it was waiting for us. Jake took a deep breath. I swallowed back my fear, and we went in. Again, the darkness was thick, the air was heavy, and the silence, suffocating. But then, we saw it. The door was still there, in the same place, alone, as if it had never left. And this time, it was already open, and inside it, the asylum still existed. Endless hallways, moldy walls, flickering lights, rusty stretchers, and in the background, the sound of voices, screaming. Jake held my hand tightly. His fingers were shaking, but I already knew we couldn't go back. Either we ended this now, or we would never get out of there. We went in. The door closed behind us. The hallway stretched, and suddenly, they appeared. Patients, doctors, nurses, all of them pale, face contorted. Some were crying, some were smiling, but their eyes were black. The sound of gurneys creaking. The voices grew louder, and in the crowd, her, the woman at the door, her mouth sewn shut, her eyes dead. And then, she raised her hand. She pointed at us, and in our heads, her voice whispered, "You belong to us now." My chest burned. The pain was unbearable. Jake fell to his knees. The entire asylum shook, and for a second, I knew, if we didn't run now, we'd never get out. I grabbed Jake. I stood up with all my strength, and we ran. The shadows tried to hold us back. The whispers tore at our ears. The ground seemed to be falling apart. But then, we saw the exit, the door, the light outside, and before it closed, we went through. We fell to the dirt floor. The gate slammed shut, and when we looked back, the asylum was no longer there. The land was empty again, as if it had never existed. But we knew the truth. He was still there, hidden, waiting, calling for new souls. Since that night, the screams have stopped. The radio never turned on by itself again. The mirrors never fogged up again. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, if I listen closely, I can still hear it. Faint, distant, but real. Come back, and one day, I know someone will hear that call and come in, and then the asylum will come back to life, and the voices will never be silenced again. Utah Lake has always been a quiet place, at least during the day. Everyone in town has heard of Old Man Jenkins, a lonely fisherman, mysterious, and presumed dead for decades. But even after all this time, they say he's still there, at night, when the waters get dark, and the wind blows whispers that no one can explain. I didn't believe those stories, until that night, until he called me. It all started when my friend Kyle suggested we go fishing. One last night fishing before winter, he said. I accepted, not knowing it was a mistake. 11:45 p.m. The lake was eerily quiet. No crickets, no birds, just the sound of the water lapping against the dock, and the boat's engine cutting through the darkness. The sky was moonless, and the boat's headlights barely illuminated the water. Kyle and I laughed, casting our bait, but deep down, something was wrong. I could feel it. It was then that Kyle got serious. "Did you hear that?" I stopped. The silence was absolute, and then the sound came. Low, slow, a sound of water being stirred, as if someone was swimming nearby. But there was no one. There were no more boats on the lake, just us, and whatever was there. My heart pounded. I grabbed the flashlight. I shined it on the dark water, and that's when I saw it. Bubbles, slowly rising to the surface, like someone was down there, like something was surfacing. And then, the boat's engine died. Kyle tried to start it again. Nothing. The water went still, and the smell in the air changed. Strong, rotten, like something rotting nearby. And then, the hand appeared. It slowly rose from the water. Pale. Bones. The fingers were too long. The nails were black and cracked. And then, another hand appeared. And then another. And then another. And from the middle of the lake, someone started to rise. My lungs seized up. The body rose slowly. The face was wrong. Skin swollen. Eyes white. Lifeless. But the mouth smiled. And then, in a wet whisper, he spoke. "Help me. Out." The boat shook on its own. The water churned. And then, the thing moved fast, right toward us. Kyle screamed. I grabbed the oar, but it was too late. His hand gripped the side of the boat. The fingers dug into the wood, and the hull began to sink. His voice came again, louder. "Help me, or come with me." The whole lake seemed to pull us in, and then, his dead eyes turned to me. I froze. His voice echoed inside my mind. Low, cold. "You called me." My blood ran cold. I hadn't called anything, or had I? Was just being there enough? That's when I saw his feet. They weren't in the water. They were floating, as if they didn't belong in this world. And then, he threw himself at us. The boat capsized. We were thrown into the icy water. His weight dragged us down, and at the bottom of the lake, I saw others, faces, hands, people trapped, eyes open, lifeless. And then, I felt hands on my ankle, pulling me to the same destination. The surface seemed far away. The air fled from my lungs, and the last thing I heard was his laughter. Then, everything went dark. I woke up on the shore of the lake. The sun was rising on the horizon. Kyle was beside me, shivering, alive. But the boat, it was gone. We didn't say anything. We just left. But before I left, I looked at the lake one last time. The water was still, peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But then, I saw it. In the middle of the lake, bubbles, slowly rising, and the silhouette of someone, standing there, waiting, watching. And then, in my mind, his voice whispered, "See you soon." I never went back to Utah Lake again, but every night, I dream about it, the smell of rotten water, with the hands that pulled me, and sometimes, I wake up with wet feet and a taste of mud in my mouth, as if I had never really escaped. I tried to forget, but he didn't forget me. After that night at Utah Lake, something changed. I would wake up in the middle of the night with a dry mouth. I could hear water dripping on the bedroom floor, and every time I looked at my feet, they were wet. At first I thought it was all in my head, maybe a trauma, a nightmare that had stuck to reality. But then, the footprints started to appear, wet footprints, always coming from the door to my bed, as if someone had come in, as if someone had visited me while I was sleeping. And every time I closed my eyes, I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible, but real, the sound of moving water, as if someone was walking around me. I stopped sleeping. I stopped leaving the house, but it was no use, because he was already with me. And then, Kyle disappeared. I tried calling, texting, nothing, until 2 days later. The police found his car, parked on the edge of Utah Lake, doors open, engine off, but no sign of Kyle. My stomach turned. I knew what had happened. He had called Kyle back, and soon, he would call me back too. I tried to run away, take a bus out of town, but the moment I got in the vehicle, the radio crackled, the light flickered, and from the speaker, his voice echoed, low, wet, slurred. "If you go, I'll pick you up." Panic took over. I ran off the bus. I went back home. I locked all the doors. But at midnight, the phone rang. The screen showed no number, just a message. Pick up. My hands were shaking, but I knew if I didn't answer, he would come and get me personally. So I answered. The silence lasted a few seconds, and then the voice came, low, whispered, "Meet me at the lake," and the call ended. The air was short in my lungs, but deep down, I knew there was no choice. I had to go, or he wouldn't let me live. 3 a.m. Utah Lake was calm, the still water, no wind, no sound, just me and him, waiting. The fog covered part of the shore. The smell of mud and rot was strong. And then I saw the bubbles rising to the surface, slow, silent, like a warning. And through the fog, he appeared, the same swollen, pale face, the white eyes, the wrong smile, and the voice came from inside my head. "I brought your friend back." My chest tightened. My vision went black. And then Kyle came out of the water. But he wasn't Kyle anymore. His skin was pale. His eyes were empty. His mouth moved soundlessly. And Old Man Jenkins's voice echoed again. "He belongs to the lake now." My throat tightened. Kyle raised his hand. He pointed at me. And in the stillness of the early morning, he whispered, "Now it's your turn." The wind blew hard. The water churned. And then the hands came out of the earth, slender fingers, cold, pulling at my feet, dragging me to the shore, pulling me down to the bottom of the lake. And in the reflection of the water, I saw my own face. But it wasn't me anymore. My skin darkened, my eyes turned white, and my body sunk forever. But then something broke the spell. A sound, loud, real, the police siren, the sound of footsteps. And then everything was gone. The water was still, the hands were gone, and in the middle of the lake, Old Man Jenkins was gone, just dead silence. The police found me on my knees on the shore, pale, shaking, but alive. They never found Kyle, and the case went cold. But I knew he was still there, along with everyone else. I left Utah. I never went back. But sometimes, when I drive by a lake, the car radio turns on by itself, and in the static, I still hear it. Low, wet, slow. "You owe me a visit," and I know that one day, he'll collect. And when that happens, there will be no turning back, because no one escapes the lake twice. No one was supposed to drive on that road after midnight, but I had no choice, and now I will never be the same. The Scarlet Highway in Moab, Utah, has that name for two reasons. One is because at sunset, the surrounding mountains glow red. The other, because it is said that the asphalt was once stained with blood. Drivers disappear there, cars are found abandoned, and at night, many say they see things that do not belong in this world. And that night, I saw it. 11:50 p.m., I was driving alone. The highway was deserted, the radio was just crackling, and the streetlights were scarce. The only thing following me was the red line on the asphalt. It stretched on, straight and endless, as if it were leading me straight to hell. My eyes felt heavy. I needed a stop, but there was nothing, just desert, just the wind blowing across the sand, until I saw something on the road, a car parked on the shoulder. The headlights were off. The driver's door was open, but no one was around, just a trail of footprints in the dust, and the silence, the damn silence. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't want to stop, but as I passed the car, my engine stalled. The dash flickered, the headlights went out, and for a second, I was trapped in darkness. My breathing quickened. My hand trembled as I turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. I tried again. Nothing. And then, something moved in the rearview mirror. My lungs seized up. The road was still empty, but in the reflection of the mirror, I saw it. A figure in the middle of the asphalt, standing still. The body was too thin and too tall. The head tilted to the side. The eyes, black, empty, and the smile, wrong, too wide. The figure didn't move, but with each blink, it was closer. 10 meters, then 5, then right next to the car. My body froze, and then a knock on the window. Once, twice, 3 times. Software, light, as if they were waiting for an answer. And then, the voice whispered, "Want a ride?" I yelled. I turned the key desperately. The engine roared. The headlights came back on, and the road was empty again. Nothing beside me, nothing in the rearview mirror, just me, and my heart trying to escape from my chest. I sped up, but the road never ended. The GPS wouldn't load. The mile marker seemed frozen, and with each passing minute, I felt like I was going back to the same place, the same car on the shoulder, the same open door, the same trail of footprints. And then, the voice came back. "You can't leave." My eyes filled with tears. Despair took over, and when I looked at the red line on the asphalt, it looked darker, as if it were wet, as if it was blood. I stepped on the accelerator. The car roared down the road. But then, a tunnel appeared ahead, and the silhouette was there, standing in the middle, waiting for me. Time seemed to slow down. I had no choice. Either I passed through it, or I would be stuck there forever. I closed my eyes. I turned the steering wheel. And then, everything went dark. I woke up hours later. The sun was rising on the horizon, and I was back at the beginning of the road. The car was stopped. The tank was still full, as if I had never left there. And then, I saw it, on the car window. There was a mark, a bloody hand, and next to it, a message written in shaky letters. "You got lucky." I never drove down the Scarlet Road again, but sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I see a car on the shoulder, with the driver's door open, and in the reflection in the rearview mirror, for just a second, I see a smile that shouldn't be there, and I know that one day, my luck might run out. I survived, but the road still wants me back. After that night, I promised never to drive there again. I changed cars, I changed cities, but what happened on the Scarlet Road never left me. I still saw the car on the shoulder, even on other roads, even in other cities, always the same. Door open, headlights off, and sometimes, if I looked too quickly, I saw someone standing next to it, tall, skinny, smiling too much. But it wasn't until 2 months later that I realized I hadn't escaped. It was 3 in the morning when my phone rang. The number, it was the same as my home number, but I was alone. I answered it with bated breath, and on the other side, silence. "Hello?" Nothing. "Who's there?" Then, the voice came, low, wet. "You're lucky." My chest froze. I hung up right away, but the phone ringed again. This time I let it ring, until it stopped on its own. And when I looked at the screen, there was a message notification. No number, no sender, just 3 words. "Come home." The temperature in the room dropped. My breath condensed in the air. And then, I heard the sound of the car. I ran to the window. My heart was racing. And on the street, right in front of my house, the same car, open door, headlights off, and, next to him, someone was watching me. My knees locked. The figure was the same as on the road, the slender body, the gray skin, and that smile that was too wide. But this time, I could hear it, his voice in my mind, low, cold. "Your luck's out." The house lights flickered. The phone rang again, and before I could react, the window glass cracked. I stepped back. The radio started to crackle. The air felt heavy in my lungs, and when I looked in the mirror, I was no longer alone. Behind me, his silhouette, standing still, smiling. And then, he whispered in my ear, "Shall we go for a walk?" My muscles froze. The whole room shook, and before I could run, the lights went out, and I felt cold fingers on my shoulder. Time slowed down. The darkness swallowed me, and when the electricity came back on, I wasn't in my room anymore. I was back on the road, inside my car. The engine turned off, the desert all around, and in front of me, the tunnel. My eyes filled with tears. How had I ended up here? I looked at the clock, 3:15 in the morning. the same time as before, and next to me, in the passenger seat, a bloody handprint and a note written on the dashboard. This time, there's no turning back. The tunnel lit up, the shadow moved inside, and I knew, if I didn't get out of there fast, I would never get out again. I turned the key, the engine roared, the lights flashed, and then the car started moving on its own. I slammed on the brakes, but it was no use. It was as if something was pulling me into the tunnel, and inside it, the world felt wrong. The walls stretched, the road turned red, and the whispers turned into screams. My vision went black, my skin burned, the road had no end. But then, something broke the spell, a headlight coming from the other side of the tunnel, fast approaching, and then a horn. The world shook, the shadows receded, the road returned to normal, and my car, it was in the middle of the road. A truck was heading straight for me. My body reacted on its own. I turned the wheel, the car skidded, the truck passed me by inches, and then time returned to normal. I was out of the tunnel, back on the road, and in the rearview mirror, nothing but darkness. My chest rose and fell rapidly. Adrenaline took over, but I was alive, and when I looked at the dashboard, the words were gone, the bloodstain was gone, and for the first time, I knew he had lost. I sped up, and I never looked back. From that day on, I never dreamed of the road again. The phone stopped ringing, the lights stopped flashing, but every now and then, if I'm driving late at night, I see a car parked on the side of the road, with the door open, and for a second, I think I see him there, waiting, watching, smiling, because I know that one day, someone will stop, and this time, he won't get away. I always knew that Skinwalker Ranch was a cursed place, but I didn't believe it until that night. Located in the middle of the Utah desert, Skinwalker Ranch has been known for centuries for its strange stories. Lights in the sky, appearances of creatures, sounds that don't belong in this world, and those who dare to enter rarely leave in one piece. My friend Ethan and I decided to explore the place, a mistake that would cost us dearly. 11:45 p.m. The truck's engine roared softly. The dirt road stretched into the darkness. The mountains in the background looked like giant shadows, and all around us, only endless desert. The ranch had already been surrounded by miles of barbed wire, but Ethan found a hole in the fence without thinking twice. We went in. The smell of dry earth and rust filled the air. The wind blew hard, and soon we saw the abandoned house. It was a large wooden house, broken windows, the fallen roof, and the feeling that something was watching us, even though there was no one around. "They say this place has never been empty," Ethan murmured. "What do you mean?" I asked, shivering. He didn't answer. He just turned on the flashlight and kept going, and I, stupid enough, followed. The wooden floor creaked under our feet. The hallways were dark, and the dust in the air made everything more suffocating. "Are you sure you want to continue?" I asked. Ethan smiled. "Afraid of what? Ghosts?" But before I could answer, something moved outside, fast, quiet, as if it were surrounding us. We shone our flashlights through the broken window. Nothing. The desert remained empty. Or at least, that's what I thought. Then we heard it. Quiet, slow, a whistle. It came from inside the house, and it wasn't human. My heart raced. The air grew colder, and the front door slammed shut on its own, so hard that the walls shook. Ethan's eyes widened. Was it the wind? But we knew the answer. The whistle continued, closer now, as if someone was calling us, or something. "Time to get out of here," I muttered. Ethan nodded, but before he could take a step, his flashlight went out. The room went dark, and that's when we saw it. The reflection in the glass, low, distant, a tall being, bones, skin cut and pale, eyes glowing and soulless. And then, out of nowhere, he moved, too fast, straight toward us. The flashlight beam came back on, and the hallway was empty. But then, the whistle echoed behind us, and we ran. We crossed the living room blindly. The door was locked, even though it hadn't been locked before, and that's when Ethan screamed. I looked back. His body was dragged across the floor. A huge shadow was pulling him into the house. He struggled, kicked, but it was useless, and, in the midst of despair, I heard his last words before he disappeared. "Run, he doesn't want you." My body froze, but then, his voice changed. The scream turned into laughter, low, slurred, as if something else was using his body. And from inside the house, the shadow rose, eyes glowing in the dark, and then, it whispered, "Now he's one of us." The door opened by itself. The wind pushed me out, and before I could do anything, the house disappeared. Not just the house, the barn, the fences, the ranch itself was gone, as if it had never existed. Just desert all around, just me, alone, and absolute silence. I stumbled back. The road seemed too far away, but I knew I had to get out of there, because all around me, the wind whistled again, and in the background, I heard Ethan laughing. I ran, and never came back. The police never found any trace of Skinwalker Ranch. Likewise, Ethan. But months later, I got a call. The number was unknown. But when I answered, the silence lasted only a second. And then, his voice came, low, slurred, and it wasn't Ethan anymore. "Why didn't you stay with us?" The phone fell from my hand. The hissing increased, and on the TV screen, the image of a wooden house appeared, the Skinwalker Ranch, and standing on the porch, Ethan, looking at me, smiling widely, and before the TV turned off by itself, he said one last sentence, low, whispered, "You can still come back." I never slept the same way again, because every night, in the middle of the night, I hear a whistle coming from outside my house, and I know that one day, if I answer the call, I will never be seen again, because whoever enters the Skinwalker Ranch never leaves in one piece. I tried to forget, but they didn't forget me. After that night at Skinwalker Ranch, everything changed. I saw shadows where there was nothing. I heard whistles when I was alone, and every night, the phone rang. I never answered it, but one night, something made me pick it up. It was 3 a.m. The phone rang again, and when I answered, the silence lasted only a few seconds, until his voice came, low, ragged, but this time, it was Ethan. He let me talk. My throat tightened. My fingers tightened on the phone. "Ethan." The sound of static filled the line, and then, he said it again. He let me talk, but just for a moment. I don't know where I am, but you need, and then his voice changed. It became more slurred, more wrong, and the heavy breathing on the other end of the line. It wasn't Ethan's anymore. My hair stood on end, and then the whisper came, "Come back, now." The call ended. The phone turned off by itself, and when I looked at the screen, the clock flashed 3:33. My chest burned. I knew I couldn't run away from this forever. I had to go back, or Ethan would be lost forever. I got in the car. The road seemed darker. The sky was starless, and the silence, it was greater than before. The feeling that something was already waiting for me. And when I got to the ranch site, he was there. The house, the barn, the fences, all back, like it had never been gone. But the wood looked older, more wrong, and standing on the porch, Ethan, waiting for me, smiling too much. I got out of the car slowly. With every step, the wind whistled, and Ethan, he didn't blink, just watched me, and when I stopped in front of him, he whispered, "You're back." His voice was different. It wasn't his. And then, he reached out. "Tap here." My chest tightened. I knew, if I touched, it would be too late. I pulled away, and Ethan's eyes turned black. The wind turned into a scream. The ground shook, and then The thing revealed itself. Shadows left the house. Slowly, they stretched, meeting with Ethan, and then his skin tore like a mask, and from inside his body, something came out, tall, skeletal, skin stitched together in scraps, sunken, lifeless eyes, and when he opened his mouth, a second face appeared inside it. Ethan, trapped inside, screaming for help. Time slowed down. His voice echoed in my mind. "Run, before he takes you too." But it was too late. The shadows grabbed me, skinny arms, two long fingers, and the voice came. The thing's voice, low, wet, torn. "You're ours now." The darkness swallowed me. I couldn't breathe. The ranch dissolved around me, and then everything went silent. When I woke up, I was back in my room. The sun was rising outside. The phone was ringing again. I looked at the screen. No number, just a message. "You belong to the ranch now." Since then, nothing has been normal. When I look in the mirror, sometimes I see Ethan behind me, still standing, smiling too much. And at night, if I listen carefully, the wind still whistles my name, calling, waiting, because I know that one day I will have to go back, and this time I will never leave again.